Welcome to Understanding Human Anatomy, Part 3 of our discussion of the collateral circulation of the upper extremity. Now, in this slide, you see I've sketched in the distal end of the humerus, proximal end of the radius, and the ulna. What we're going to do is sketch in the brachial artery, which comes down and bifurcates into a radial artery and an ulnar artery. We'll need to draw in profunda, coming down like so, and remember that profunda ends by a bifurcation into two. And then we need the common interosseous, which divides into an anterior interosseous and a posterior interosseous. So we covered those arteries when we talked about the arterial supply to the upper extremity and talked about the brachial artery, the radial and ulnar arteries. Let me fill in some labels so we have everything straight. The brachial artery, profunda brachii, and we're just showing the distal part of profunda. I started the diagram inferior to where it branches off the brachial artery. We have the radial artery, the ulnar artery, the common interosseous artery, the anterior interosseous artery, and the posterior interosseous artery. And remember, even though they look like they're side by side to each other here, the anterior interosseous is on the anterior surface of the interosseous membrane, and the posterior interosseous is on the posterior surface. The terminal branches of profunda are the radial collateral, and the medial collateral. Now, there are actually 4 collateral routes that pass around the elbow. Now, I'm going to start on the radial side because we only have one artery to look at coming off of the radial artery, and that is the radial recurrent artery. And remember, whenever we see the term recurrent, it means that it is turning 180 degrees and going back from the direction that it originally started. So the radial recurrent is running from distal to proximal instead of the other way around. And the radial recurrent artery anastomoses with the radial collateral artery. Right? Radial collateral with radial recurrent to form a connection between profunda and the radial artery. Moving over to the ulnar artery now, we have a branch, the inferior ulnar collateral. The inferior ulnar collateral. And the inferior ulnar collateral will anastomose with a branch from the ulnar artery, the anterior ulnar recurrent. think you're seeing a pattern here. The collaterals anastomose with the recurrence to form collateral routes. So the anterior ulnar recurrent with the inferior ulnar collateral. Another branch of brachial is the superior ulnar collateral, and let me put the label in here. And we have another branch from the radial, and we have another branch from the ulnar, the posterior ulnar recurrent. And we'll get the line to it. So posterior ulnar recurrent anastomoses with the superior ulnar collateral. Now again, in this diagram they look side by side. In reality, the anterior ulnar recurrent with the inferior ulnar collateral is on the anterior side of the medial epicondyle. The posterior ulnar recurrent with the superior ulnar collateral is on the posterior side of the medial epicondyle. Now there's one more anastomosis here, and that is a branch of the posterior interosseous. May come off the common interosseous. It's right about where the posterior separates from the common, but it passes to the posterior side draw some dashed lines in there to indicate it's going behind the bones. This is the interosseous recurrent. And let me draw a couple of lines in for it. One right there. And another one up here. The interosseous recurrent. And the interosseous recurrent anastomoses with the medial collateral. So there are four routes, there are four collateral routes around the elbow. Radial collateral with radial recurrent, medial collateral with interosseous recurrent, superior collateral with posterior ulnar recurrent, inferior ulnar collateral with the anterior ulnar recurrent. So a very rich collateral circulation around the elbow. And should the brachial artery become blocked, all of these would open up. Again, wouldn't be enough blood to keep the muscles working at their maximum capacity, but it will let the tissue live, and these small vessels will then dilate to become large vessels and carry more blood. Now, in the last slide, we'll look at the anastomoses between the radial and ulnar arteries at the distal end, the two palmar arches. And we look at the distal end of the radial and ulnar arteries. Draw in a little piece of ulnar artery, little piece of radial artery. Put some labels here so we keep them straight. So radial and ulnar arteries. The radial forms the deep palmar arch and it has a superficial palmar branch. The ulnar forms the superficial palmar arch and it has a deep palmar branch. And like I did when we talked about these, I'm going to draw some black lines to indicate the junction between the deep palmar branch and the deep palmar arch, and the superficial palmar branch and the superficial palmar arch. So let's put some labels in. And the deep palmar branch, and down here we'll have the superficial palmar arch, and over here the superficial palmar branch. And again, I'll draw a line to it. Now, this is a very rich collateral route because it affords end-to-end contact a double end-to-end contact between the radial and ulnar arteries. And if you did have a blockage in one of these arteries, the blood supply would virtually be unimpeded. It's such a rich collateral route. Now, again, we're going to have branches. From the deep arch, those would be the metacarpal arteries. Then we have metacarpal arteries coming from the superficial arch. And with the exception of the extreme ends, the metacarpal arteries from the superficial and deep arch interconnect to form common metacarpal arteries, and then these arteries will in turn give rise to the digital arteries. So where we have the union of the metacarpal arteries to form the common metacarpals is yet another possible route for collateral circulation. Draw in the and down here the digital. So, very rich collateral connections between the radial and ulnar arteries and the metacarpal arteries and digital arteries. That concludes our discussion of collateral circulation in the upper extremity. Thank you for your attention.